Welcome back. Well, in this week's economic week ahead, tariff plans ahead of Wednesday's deadline, OPEC output increases, Fed minutes and AI chip demand are some of the things in the spotlight. And joining us for a look ahead is Joshua Mahony, Chief Market Analyst at Scope Markets. Thank you so much for your time, Joshua. Well, I mean, it was tariff week. I don't know if it still is, considering the fact that that deadline has now been moved from the 9th of July to the 1st of August. Of course, no surprise there that Donald Trump has changed his mind. What are markets pricing in ahead of all of this?
Exactly. I mean, look, we came into this week expecting massive volatility there. That's because we were expecting to see those reciprocal tariffs coming into play on Wednesday. That meant that nations were essentially scrambling to strike a deal before that deadline. And that deadline was April. It turned into July. Now it's the 1st of August. So those that say taco, Trump always chickens out, well, they can say that they've been proven right once again. He very clearly does not want to enact those reciprocal tariffs, and therefore he just keeps pushing it into the future. I don't necessarily think that's great news when it comes to those trade negotiations, because it does strengthen the hand of those that are negotiating with him, because he clearly doesn't want to enact those elevated tariff levels. It also has knock-on implications for the Federal Reserve, in my mind, because if you keep pushing these tariffs down the line, they'll never cut rates, because they don't necessarily know what the state of play is for the US economy. So that was the main sort of port of call when it came to the big data this week, or the big announcement. Aside from that, we've got RBNZ, the RBA, both of rate decisions, and the FOMC minutes.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, just on that still, as much as, there's this hesitation from Trump to really implement those reciprocal tariffs, he's still dishing out threats, and particularly to BRICS countries and BRICS-aligned countries. And China has actually come out to say that, coercing countries through tariffs is not a good idea. And I'm wondering, because, I mean, as it stands, the relationship between China and the US seems relatively stable, but could these threats then put them back a little bit?
Potentially. I mean, look, they're not in a perfect place by any stretch of the imagination, because whilst the last time that we heard of a major announcement between the two sides was the breakthrough that essentially saw the Chinese getting more US tech, the US getting more rare earth materials, we still have significant trade barriers in place from the US. Remember those fentanyl tariffs? Well, they're still in place. We've got that 10% tariff. Now we're talking about 10% tariffs additionally for BRICS members. So that relationship is still fractured at best. But it's interesting, because ultimately you've now got the Chinese, who are now supposedly the proponents of free trade. But as we've seen, as Donald Trump has said, he wants to open up the Chinese to US businesses. So the Chinese may make it out like they're all about free trade, but that's not necessarily the case. It's very difficult for businesses to get into China and compete on a level playing field. Whether Donald Trump will be able to achieve that at the end remains to be seen. In actual fact, China might utilize this to strengthen their hand when it comes to trading with other nations and keep their barriers up and just swallow some of the tariffs. So that remains to be seen. But certainly BRICS is that sort of movement against the West, so to speak, that new burgeoning group of nations. And the idea that we're going to see 10% tariffs on BRICS nations, of course, has a knock-on implication for those nations themselves. It also has a knock-on implication for potential countries when they're weighing up the possible benefits of joining BRICS. Well, there's also downsides in the form of a 10% tariff with the US.
Yeah, indeed. Still in political developments, we have Elon Musk saying that he's going to start a new political party in the US. And once again, Tesla shareholders really feeling the knock-on effects of a CEO whose attention is split. What details are out concerning Musk's new venture?
Well, not too much, but I mean, ultimately, he's talking about being this, new option, a new way for the US. But, I just don't think it's going to fly. Perhaps he's more popular than Donald Trump in certain elements of the country. But in actual fact, he's done a very good job of alienating himself from both sides of the political spectrum over in the US. First and foremost, he sided with Donald Trump over the Republicans. Some were saying that he was winning the election for Donald Trump, and he reminded Donald Trump of that down the line with his powerful control of the X platform. Soon enough, then he was fighting against Donald Trump. So it's not to say that the Democrats came on side with him, but he alienated the Republicans in that one. And now he's, instead of moving away from politics, which is exactly what the Tesla shareholders would have want, he's now saying that he's going to start his own party. So very much doing the opposite from what everyone's calling for him to do at the moment. And there are many that will probably think that his time as a CEO probably should be up. And that if he's going to continue to pull off stunts like this and move more towards a political sphere, then possibly they're better served being led by someone else.
Just lastly, as we wrap up the conversation, other people that are doing the opposite of what markets expect is OPEC. They've decided to implement a more than expected output hike on oil production. Any reaction from the oil market?
Well, actually, oil is higher, so I guess it's a case of sell the rumor, buy the fact. Essentially, when it came to oil, look, higher than expected output production, that's certainly significant. It's interesting that this is happening at a time when there's significant demand within the market, so it can by and large swallow up that excess production. There's question marks about whether it would be the same kind of thing and have the same impact if it was later on in the year where the demand is a little bit low. Also, bear in mind, of course, we saw Donald Trump allaying that deadline in terms of the reciprocal tariff. So that is pro-growth in its nature. It means it's pro-demand for oil. So we saw a lift from that perspective as well. But certainly this, again, is the Saudis pushing for greater market share after all these years of trying to prop up prices.
All right. Well, we do have to wrap up the conversation there, Joshua. Thank you so much for giving us insight on what is coming up during the week and what the major focus points will be for investors. That was Joshua Mahony, Chief Market Analyst at Scope Markets, with the global economic week ahead.